A young woman was discovered burned alive in the woods of Squaw Valley in Northern California in 1984. Her true identity was never discovered, and she was buried as a Jane Doe. A year later, another woman was discovered dead in a box outside a campground, 100 miles away. Her true identity was unknown, and she too was buried under the name Jane Doe. The second Jane Doe's killing was linked to a serial killer, Benjamin Herbert Boyle. But the facts behind the first Jane Doe's death were unknown until 1993. A young woman called Terry called America's Most Wanted in 1993 and gave the investigators the information they needed to identify both Jane Does and prosecute their genuine murderer, their mother, Theresa Knorr. A woman handling the tip lines for America's Most Wanted receives a call from a sobbing young woman on October 20th, 1993. They just aired a show about two unidentified murder victims, both young women in their late teens or early 20s, whose cases had been unsolved for years. The first victim was discovered in 1985 in Placer County, California, off a remote road. Her mouth and wrists were covered in duct tape, and she had been charred almost beyond recognition. A long gash appeared on her back, caused by a knife. A few of her possessions, as well as many diapers, were discovered near her body, promoting authorities to believe that she had an infant who was now missing and potentially in danger. She was alive when she was set on fire, according to an autopsy. However, authorities were unable to identify her, and she did not match any of the missing persons reports. The second victim, discovered a year later in Martis Creek Lake in Truckee, California, had been hogtied, packed into a huge popcorn cup box, and dumped. Her body had decayed to the point where it was impossible to identify or determine her cause of death. Her chipped front teeth were the only distinguishing traits on her remains. However, no one had reported this young woman missing, so her case was also closed. Terry Knorr, the woman on the other end of the tip line, introduces herself to the operator. She has an outstanding story of cruelty to tell, one so shocking that no one has believed her for years. Susan and Sheila, her older sisters, are the two slain women. She says to the operator, she claims their mother, Theresa Knorr, was the murderer. Terry ran away from home when she was 15 years old. She constantly found herself on the wrong side of the law while living on the streets and battling mental health concerns and addiction. Every time she was arrested, she would tell the police about the horror movie that had been her life growing up. She tried to persuade them that her mother was a monster who had tortured and murdered two of her children. No one believed her, not even her therapist, until she was contacted by the Placer County Sheriff's Department, who recognized much of the information Terry provided as being consistent with their unsolved Jane Doe cases. Finally, someone believed her. Theresa Knorr had always been a domineering, manipulative individual. She dropped out of school when she was 16 to marry Clifford Sanders. She gave birth to her first child, Howard, while they were married. She was described as being envious and possessive of Clifford, accusing him of cheating on her regularly. Clifford punched her at least once during their frequent fights. Then, on July 6, 1964, they fought once more. Clifford announced his separation from Theresa, who was expecting Sheila. As he walked out the door, she shot him in the back with a rifle. The slug got stuck in his heart and killed him. Theresa claimed self-defense and pleaded not guilty. It worked. She was found not guilty. Theresa, now a single mother of two, began to drink more frequently. She started a string of romances as well. She married a Marine named Robert Knorr and had 4 additional children with him: Susan, Robert, William, and Terry. Howard and Sheila were adopted by Robert, and they changed their last names to Knorr as well. Theresa's excessive drinking, jealousy, and suspicions of infidelity drove her husband away once more. They divorced in 1970 after he departed in 1969. Theresa rebuffed Robert's request to keep in touch with his children. She married 2 more times, both of which ended in divorce, owing to her drinking and jealousy. Her emotional and physical health began to suffer after her previous divorce. She put on weight and had paranoid beliefs. She pulled the children out of school, disconnected their phone service, and wouldn't allow them to go outdoors. Theresa, who was always in charge, began to grow increasingly violent and unpredictable. She would accuse her children of doing things that they hadn't done and punish them for their fictitious actions. Her children described the weapon she used to beat them: the Board of Education, a 3-foot-long, 12-inch thick board with an electrical tape grip wrapped around one end. Theresa would force her children to restrain their siblings while she beat them. But the beatings weren't the only form of abuse she received. She would use cigarettes to burn her children, have them do arduous labor in the heat, deprive them of sleep, and toss knives at them as a game. Terry was once put in a chest freezer for allegedly informing others that Theresa didn't look after her children. But it was her daughters who bore the brunt of her rage and cruelty. Susan and Sheila, the two oldest, were pushed into prostitution by her. Susan was a witch. She believed at one point, who had cast a spell on her, causing her to acquire weight. So, in addition to abusing Susan, Theresa began to force-feed her to acquire weight. Susan would be forced to eat all of Theresa's macaroni and cheese, which she would make in large pots with hunks of lard. Theresa would press spoonfuls of food into Susan's mouth if she was too full to eat anymore. If Susan puked, Theresa would force her to eat it as well. What happened afterwards is disputed among sources. Susan is said to have run away, while some claim she was arrested while strolling down the street. The crucial thing is that she was finally able to report her mother's abuse to the authorities. Of course, Theresa denied it. Caseworkers interrogated the other children, but with their mother present, the children, terrified, backed up their mother and denied that she had ever hit them. DHS terminated the case and returned Susan to her mother's custody when they were satisfied. Susan had already been through hell, but it was nothing compared to what she was about to face. Theresa gagged her and shackled her under the dining room table. Theresa proceeded to scream at her and force-feed her. She even enlisted the help of her two sons, Robert and William, to defeat Susan. For approximately 2 years, this continued. What transpired afterwards is a matter of debate. Theresa allegedly gave Terry, a little child, a pistol, and told her to keep it on Susan while she went into another room, according to Robert. Terry was surprised, and the gun fired, hitting Susan in the belly. Susan was shot by Terry's mother during an altercation, according to Terry. Theresa had the boys bring their sister into the bathroom and place her in the tub, rather than calling an ambulance. Theresa bound her to the soap dish with her handcuffs. Theresa managed to bring Susan back to health over the next few weeks. Susan went back under the table once she was well enough to get out of the tub. She pleaded with her mother to simply let her go, promising not to tell anyone what had occurred. This carried on for a long time until Theresa finally gave in. Susan agreed on one condition. She had to let her mother remove the bullet from her body so Susan wouldn't have any proof to use against her later. Susan agreed, desperate for a way out. So Theresa gave her antiseptic pills and a lot of liquor to her daughter till she passed out on the kitchen floor. Then, with Terry at her side as her surgeon's assistant, Theresa used an X-Acto knife to dig the bullet out of her daughter's back. To hide the bullet, Theresa flushed it down the toilet. Susan, on the other hand, never recovered. She awoke in excruciating pain. Ibuprofen and antibiotics were given to her by Theresa. Susan developed hallucinations as a result of the sickness and agony, and she soon fell into a coma. Susan was just faking it, and Theresa left her unconscious body on the kitchen floor, directing her other children to simply step over her. Theresa simply put diapers on Susan as she lost control of her bladder. Theresa believed Susan's body turning yellow from sepsis and jaundice was proof that she was possessed by a demon. And she believed that was the only way to exorcise the demon was to use fire. So, Theresa covered Susan's mouth with duct tape and secured her wrist with it. Susan and her meager things, including her diapers, were to be loaded into the trunk of the automobile by her sons. They then went to a remote location and transported Susan and her belongings to a location just off the road. Theresa instructed her sons to smother everything in gasoline, including their sister. She then had William light a match, and they drove away, Susan's body blazing in the rearview mirror. Theresa's rage has shifted to Sheila now that Susan has left. Theresa began force-feeding Sheila, just as she had Susan. She once smashed a spoon so violently into Sheila's mouth that it chipped both of her front teeth. Theresa then accused Sheila of contracting a venereal disease and transmitting it to her via the toilet seat. As she had done with Susan, she thrashed Sheila and chained her under the table. Sheila was not allowed to use the restroom or the bathtub. Sheila continued to be beaten by Theresa, who demanded that she confess to infecting her mother with the venereal disease. When that failed, Theresa bound her daughter and stuffed her into a broom closet. She abandoned her for weeks, leaving her without food or drink. When Sheila screamed and pleaded to be let out, Theresa merely turned up the volume on the television to drown her out. Terry attempted to sneak water to her sister, but her mother arrived home first. Sheila began to have hallucinations about rising up to a light. She then fell silent. A loud thump was the last thing they heard from the closet. A revolting, rotting stench emanated from the closet a few days later. Sheila's rotting body fell out when Theresa finally unlocked the closet door. Theresa enlisted the help of her boys to dispose of it. Robert brought the largest box that he could, a popcorn cut box from his previous job at the movie theater. They wrapped Sheila's body in bed linens and placed her inside the box before loading her into the car's trunk. Terry was given the task of cleaning the closet where her sister had passed away. Meanwhile, Theresa and her boys traveled to a remote location to dump and burn Sheila's body, just as they had Susan's. However, a police officer approached them before they could empty the package. Theresa was able to talk herself out of any suspicion by explaining that her boys needed to use the restroom. Even though she could smell some decomposition, the police officer just advised her to walk on. So, they drove to Martis Creek Lake and put Sheila's remains in the box. They didn't stay to set it on fire since they didn't want to get caught. The police officers were taken aback by Terry's recollections. They couldn't fathom the degree of cruelty she'd recounted. The information she supplied, however, was too similar to the crime scenes to be ignored. They provided answers to questions that had perplexed the investigators, such as why diapers were found near the Placer County Jane Doe, and what caused the wound on the back. As a result, arrest warrants for William, Robert, and Theresa Knorr were issued in November 1993. Robert was quickly apprehended. He was serving a 2-year sentence in a Nevada jail for shooting and killing a bartender during a heist 2 years prior. William was a resident of Woodland, California, where he worked. Theresa, on the other hand, was more difficult to track down and arrest. By this time, she had moved to Salt Lake City, Utah, and was working as a carer under her maiden name. She had withdrawn $4,000 from her bank account and told her employer that she was leaving town. But authorities captured her just in time. All accusations against Robert were dismissed in exchange for his testimony, except for one court of accessory after the fact. He pleaded guilty and received a 3-year term, which he will serve concurrently with his previous sentence. In exchange for his testimony, William was sentenced to probation and a course of mandatory therapy. 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, and 2 counts of serial murder and torture were filed against Theresa Knorr. She first pleaded not guilty, but after learning of her son's plea deals to testify against her, she changed her plea to guilty to avoid the death penalty. She was convicted to 2 consecutive life terms on October 17, 1995. She is currently incarcerated at the California Institution for Women in Chino, California, where she is serving her term. When she becomes 81 in 2027, she will be eligible for parole. Robert was released in 2013. William now works, has a family, and lives a normal life. In 2019, Terry continued to tell her story after her mother was arrested, appearing on several true crime television shows, including Cold Case File. Until her death in 2011 from heart failure. She was 41 years old at the time.